Hello, this is Anastasia Melnik with you with Q&A show. We're here today with my guest Oleksiy Semeniy, who is the director of the Institute of Global Transformations. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. So what we're going to talk today is I would like just to separate those two subjects. So what's happening inside of the Ukraine and what is the situation in general on international area and how it is all connected with politics here. And I would like to start with what happened basically in Odessa and Mariupol. There's a lot of people, terrorists, separatists, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian. How would you describe the situation and if there's any trend that you can see?
Starting from the first point, the situation is quite complicated. Why? Because there are too many actors, too many interests, too many provocations. That's why just to talk, starting from Odessa, what has happened and probably what will happen if it will not going to happen. In Odessa it was, I would say, definitely a provocation, using many of the people despite their will, and then trying just to threaten all the citizens in this city and also all around about some consequences if they do be active in some political affairs. What is now happening in Mariupol, it's a little bit another story, because Mariupol is a part of Donetsk region or Donbas region. There are another interests. Also quite interesting point is that if beforehand we have some events going on in Donetsk, in Lugansk, in Slovyansk, in Kramatorsk. These are mostly some cities with some industrial culture, but not as Mariupol, because Mariupol is not only a city with some quite huge industrial plants, but it's also a port. And it means quite a lot, because it's a question of Azov Sea, it's a question of
and
export.
That's consequently an interest of Russia.
To some extent, yes, but it's a little bit another situation. Plus, if you take into account Donetsk region, it's not a united region as in all over Ukraine. If you take any of the region, you have some parts. And some parts, if the region is quite huge, they are a little bit different. For example, in the northern part of Donetsk region, it's mostly, I would say, industrial part. Despite this corner a little bit out of Slovyansk, starting from Svetogorsk and then going to Kharkiv region. But Mariupol is, or southern part of Donetsk region, is not so, I would say, definitely industrialized and definitely Russian populated. There are a lot of nations there, starting from Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and many, so they are very mixed, because it's a general situation all around the Black Sea, especially our territory of Black Sea. On the shore, all the nations are quite mixed, because there are a lot of economic interests. So it's the different situation, but now what's going on, I will not say that it's just so complicated as it is in Donetsk or Lugansk or even Slovyansk. Mariupol is everything, I would say, on the starting point. If the power will not solve the problem quite quickly and effectively, it could just escalate further on. But now the situation is more or less under some control.
So you would say that the seaports is something really specific for the situation, comparing to what happened in Donetsk and comparing to the situation in northern, basically, part. That's something
yes, of course.
specific.
Plus, in Mariupol, you can take into account there are two huge plants who actually define the life of the whole city, and both of the plants are in ownership of Mr. Akhmetov or SKM. So the leverage of influence of personal Mr. Akhmetov in Mariupol is much more than even in Donetsk or some other pockets.
The richest person in Ukraine.
Not only because well known, because just the industrial plants, these huge metal steels are in his ownership. So he could influence both the staff of these plants, and because the staff is having families, and you can multiply around 3 or 4, so one person working in the plant, it means 3 or 4 persons being just familiar or to some extent even dependent on the activity of the plant. That's why in Mariupol it's just a little bit another situation.
And there are a lot of oligarchs now that are in charge of what's happening. I mean, not only in a bad way, but Akhmetov, for example, the richest person in Ukraine, could play much bigger role and kind of pro-Ukrainian, because it's in his particular interest for Ukraine to stay as the united country why isn't he doing anything about it, really?
As many people in Ukraine, especially so-called oligarchs, he is in a very complicated situation because it's not so simple. In general, theoretically, yes, he should be interested in Ukraine being a united country, not falling apart, on the one hand, but on the other hand, he's quite dependent on Russia, starting from, to some extent, his industrial capacities, having quite many links to Russia, I mean exporting some products and importing as well some products, then financially, because he, as far as I know, he have some credit loans from Russian Federation, so he cannot just cut all these links. Plus, he should take into account the moods of the people who are in that region, that many of them more or less are still friendly to Russian Federation. Some part of them are even much more friendly to Russian Federation as to Ukraine. So it's we can discuss post-Soviet legacy or some other interest, but it's just the situation. That's why Akhmetov, on the one hand, theoretically interested in not falling apart Ukraine, but on the other hand dependent on Russian Federation. And also probably the third point, and it is now obviously he and probably Donetsk elites, they try, and it was the line after some a little shock after Mr. Yanukovych fled unexpectedly for I would suppose for everybody, then they tried to make some deal with Central Powers in Kiev, because they suppose the Central Powers in Kiev not very friendly towards Donetsk elites, and that's why they tried to have some leverage on the situation to start this deal or to start bargaining about the deal, mainly just having the interest, okay guys, you will be ruling in Kiev, we will rule as beforehand in Donetsk, and under this condition we are ready just to sit on the table and to have a deal. Otherwise we will push the situation more and more to escalation.
Further. Okay, so considering all the situations that we could see on a TV, we are constantly communicating with people who are living there. Would you see a trend that could say what Russia is up to? Because there's most of the experts, they say, no, we don't know what to expect. Even the political scientists, they say so. Because in most of the situations, they say, okay, Russia won't go any further. And then every time we see that it does.
Probably the answer was any other question, talking about political scientists. And the situation now is not very much about the science, but about psychology. Personally, about Mr. Putin's psychology, what he actually wants, what he actually expects. From my perspective, and probably now we start going from internal situation to external, Mr. Putin is a quite difficult situation after annexation of Crimea, after what have been done, what will be done in just nearest weeks, because actually he has broken many rules, international rules, more or less agenda what was since minimum Yalta, and we can talk even more than minimum Yalta beforehand, and it was just some kind of game, and it is now some kind of game, just to delete all the rules in order afterwards, when probably the whole situation will be to less or much extent settled, and all the parties will be around the table, then to start the deal from the scratch. This is now actually what Mr. Putin is going to do, because otherwise, and he understands strategically, starting from the resources, starting from the whole situation, allies which are actually zero for Russia in large terms, I mean geopolitically, because talking about the China, it is not an ally, it is just not friendly, but not an enemy state, just more or less neutral.
What role does China play in this situation?
China is just playing quite interesting role. To some extent, on the one hand, having quite a good and favorable situation due to two things, due to the United States and to Russia. On the other hand, China is very anxious because, and it was just the first point with the Crimea, where Chinese, they did declarations where they tried on the one hand not to quarrel with Russia, but on the other hand, not to align with Russia, because territorial integrity, it exactly the red line for China, which even for Russia, or it doesn't matter for any of the country, they will not cross, because it's the question of their utmost security, utmost importance. That's why it is the red line. And you will see China will never, on the diplomatic and legal level, accept the annexation of Crimea unless Ukraine itself declares, yes, okay, now we declare that
Crimea is gone.
No, not gone, but it is just another territory, it is the Russian territory until this. Because this is just a pure legalistic and very strict approach, plus Chinese, they proved they are ready to wait, and they can wait 10 years, 20 years, it doesn't matter. You can take the example of Taiwan, you can take the example of Hong Kong and Macau. They are quite good guys in this. And the second point, first factor is for China is, of course, Russia, and the second, United States. Because United States beforehand for the last 4 years they officially declared, and they did a lot to make so-called pivot to Asia. And pivot to Asia meant that much more resources were dedicated not to European, I mean in security and economic terms, but to Asian market or Asian, let's talk about even battlefield in some theoretical games. And now what is going on in Ukraine, it forced United States to be very active and just on the way of this pivot to Asia, just to turn back to Europe and be very active to Europe. And it means for China quite a good situation, because now they are not confronted with such an activity of United States, which they should have confronted in the case beforehand. And now...
And they really push European Union, because we could see that how many times the US forces were really proactive in this situation.
Yes, of course, because there are two explanations. Firstly, it's just the historical tradition that the United States during the last 60 years is much more eager to act very quickly, very effectively if it is needed. All the EU states during the latest 30 years, none of them, even in the United Kingdom, proved themselves to act as smoothly and effectively as United States could and did. But secondly, it is much more easier because it's not your direct neighborhood. So in some terms, it even for United States, it's quite comfortable situation to have both Russia and European Union fully involved and suffering in this mess called Ukrainian crisis, because on the one hand they can just screw up the Russian Federation in the middle term, and they obviously probably will do so. On the other hand, not to let European Union to be so ambitious. If we just recall in the memories the ambitions of European Union 10 years before, being a global power, not only economic terms, security, military terms, now everybody has forgotten about this. Why? Because all these crises starting from Mediterranean, and they proved European Union is not capable in military terms to act effectively, is not capable to be quite effective and quick. It's very important in coming to some standpoint. It doesn't matter what standpoint, but just to have one standpoint, and they proved they are not very eager with this. Okay, we can take objectively, it is very hard 27 countries to have united opinion, but it doesn't matter in global terms. You should do this. If you don't do, you lose. And yes, in this mess, both Russia and European Union, compared with the United States being a little bit outside but very active, inside they are, I would say, losers in this situation in comparison with the United States, if we take just very cynically the situation. That's why the United States, they can afford themselves to do this, and just from starting from theoretical geopolitical terms, from even the fathers of geopolitics, Mackinder, Mechen, so there are states of so-called Rim. It means firstly United Kingdom, that times, then United States, so all the countries which are onshore countries, and then the countries who are inside the continent. It means Russian Federation, to some extent even Germany in previous century. And they are...
And then defines how they act on international sphere.
And it pushes these countries, and it's, according to the theory, it is an immense conflict between these two groups of countries. On the one hand, the countries who control the oceans or the ocean, and the countries who control the territory, the land. And now Ukraine, and it was according to all the theory that this territory is a heartland of Eurasia, and Eurasia is actually the central part of all these inside continent countries.
So you would say that it could be described basically in terms of this theory?
Yes, yes, it could be described. Unfortunately for Ukraine...
what would it mean actually for Ukraine if we would describe that in this theory, and if we would develop the situation and what we now have? So we have basically few stakeholders, if not paying attention to the fact that there are really a lot of the actors, a lot of the interests, and that makes the situation a little bit messy. But if we're just turning to this theory, what would it mean for Ukraine, and what outcomes should we expect from that?
Now the situation is that you could hardly predict what will be the outcomes, because there are two main actors. This is not a little bit, absolute mess. And generally now we are
just trying not to make that,
but
people panic.
Not a panic, it's just the reality. Panic will be probably another story. But the situation is very complicated, because now Ukraine is more and more moving to a situation being a battlefield. Being a battlefield
for
is...
Ukraine, basically.
Yeah, Ukraine is a battlefield. It's not very good for any country to be a battlefield. That's why, probably from my point of view, we Ukrainians should do everything possible to go out of this situation, not to be a battlefield. But unfortunately, according to all the configurations, now we have very little chances to go out of the battlefield. Now, probably a realistic scenario is to step by step to go a little bit out of this situation with minimum losses or acceptable losses, because the interest
considering the constellation of powers, how to make it for Ukrainian government?
Firstly, you should be very strong inside, very strong and smart inside, coordinated inside. Unfortunately, I would say just openly, mostly many of the steps taken, we're not talking about Yanukovych, it's just a different story. But about the new government, it's not only strictly government, but the people acting president, the parliament, coalition, new coalition, they were not very successful in dealing with all the matters, because firstly, they were too optimistic about now Yanukovych has fled or has gone, now we are the winners, we can do anything, and they made on the start a few but very crucial mistakes. And the outcomes of the mistakes we have now, and we will have a little bit long. They overestimated their own resources and powers, underestimated the reaction of Russians, or some things which are very irritating to Russian Federation. They probably underestimated or overestimate some things related to reactions from the United States, European Union. And that's why now we have so dramatic results. I would say if necessary decisions or steps had been taken at the beginning of March, we would have not be in the situation with de facto annexation of Crimea. We would not have so much troubles with the east of Ukraine and even the threat for the southern of Ukraine. And coming back to what wants Mr. Putin, from what we started, now he wants definitely the first, the first point or the next point for him, the most important is just, as far as I understand him, to make anything possible, just not to let presidential elections to happen at the end of May. The first row and the second row as well. Because if they happen, and I hope they happen, this will be quite a good fixing point for Ukraine, and not only for Ukraine. And then based on this fixing point, you can go on further and further. Now we have quite a difficult economic situation, despite the fact that the loan had been...
processes would go easier, like integration,
not easy.
Fixing the inner politics and foreign politics of Ukraine
to some extent easier, to some extent it's just in this situation, in this mess, in this quite a huge crisis, we don't understand even now the whole let's say diplomatically amount of the crisis, but it's not about easier, it's just to have some fixing points, because if you have just the situation where you have no fixing points, it's very difficult, because you cannot stand on something. You are in the space and you have no possibilities to fix something.
Describe Ukraine and its government right now.
Now it is to some extent as in open space. In open space, to some extent, yes, external factors, but to some extent we should admit and we should talk openly due to wrong faults committed in the last months. And this is a question of personality. This is a question of some brains and strategies to be implemented, to be done.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm just reminding you that we had this talk basically on international relations and what happened during last week in Ukraine here with Oleksiy Semeniy, director of the Institute of Global Transformations and a former student scholar of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung,
yeah.
as far as I know.
Yeah.
Really nice. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you again in our studios soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.